All right, strap yourselves in. We're going deep today, diving headfirst into a true crime case that's about as heavy as it gets. The Lost Boys of Houston.
A case that left a permanent scar on the city, really. Back in the 1970s, this one shook everyone to the core. To this day, it's considered one of the most prolific serial killings in U.S. history.
Prolific is an understatement, honestly. And what makes this case even more disturbing is the setting. We're not talking about some dark alley or forgotten corner of the city.
No, not at all. This all happened in the Heights, a neighborhood known for its close-knit community, a real family-friendly atmosphere.
Yeah, picture this. Tree-lined streets, kids playing outside, neighbors chatting over fences.
That was the Heights. And then boys started vanishing, one after another, seemingly into thin air.
Just gone. Poof. It's almost unimaginable. The first disappearances happened in December 1970.
2 teenagers vanished without a trace.
I can't even begin to fathom the fear that must have gripped the community. I mean, how do you even process that?
It's important to remember the context, too. This was the 1970s. Societal norms were shifting. There was a lot of change happening.
Right, the Cultural Revolution, so to speak.
Exactly. And the idea of a serial killer preying on young boys, especially in a seemingly safe, quiet suburb, well, it was almost unthinkable. People just didn't want to believe it.
So, the initial reaction from the authorities?
Well, the police initially dismissed these missing boys as runaways. They attributed it to typical teenage rebellion, which, let's be honest, was pretty common back then.
So the families were basically left in limbo.
Yeah, desperately searching for answers while the authorities seemed to be, well, brushing them off.
And as months turned into years, more boys vanished.
Exactly. The sense of frustration and fear in the Heights, it just kept growing. These families, they knew their sons, and they knew, deep down, something far more sinister was happening.
But their pleas for a more thorough investigation
fell on deaf ears, it seemed. It's heartbreaking to think about those families, that frantic worry escalating with each passing day, their hopes fading.
And then, the case takes a turn that's straight out of a nightmare. The killer turns out to be someone they knew, a familiar face in the neighborhood.
Someone who was, believe it or not, known to give candy to children.
It sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. Talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
This is where Dean Corll enters the picture. He's the man at the center of this horrific web. On the surface, he seemed friendly, harmless, almost like a kindly uncle.
But behind that facade
lurked a monster. This guy orchestrated the abduction, torture, and murder of at least 28 boys.
28. It's a number that's almost impossible to grasp. It's just pure evil. And to make matters even worse, he wasn't alone, right? He had teenage accomplices.
2 teenagers, to be exact. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. They became entangled in Corll's web of terror.
I mean, what kind of mind games was he playing to pull teenagers into something so horrific?
That's a question that has baffled investigators and psychologists for decades. The sources we've looked at suggest these boys were drawn in through manipulation and coercion. Corll was a master manipulator. He knew how to prey on vulnerabilities.
Yeah, offering them maybe a sense of belonging or power.
Maybe. It's hard to say for sure, but the question remains, were they victims themselves or willing participants in these crimes? It's a line that becomes incredibly blurry in a case like this.
Right, and that's a debate that continues to this day.
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom what must have been going through their minds at the time.
A chilling thought, isn't it? These were teenagers caught in this horrific web of manipulation and horror. It really makes you think about their role in all of this. Were they victims themselves, or were they willing participants?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's haunted investigators and psychologists for decades now. It's a line that can get incredibly blurry, especially in a case as complex as this one. But to truly understand the depths of what happened here, we need to delve into the mind of Dean Corll. What could drive a person to commit such monstrous acts?
It's easy to just label someone like Corll as evil and call it a day. But the reality is much more complicated. It's not like there's a switch that flips. It's more like a whole bunch of factors all coming together that contribute to that descent into darkness.
So are there any clues in the sources we've looked at, anything in his past that might shed some light on his motivations?
Well, the sources do mention some pretty unsettling details about Corll's behavior before the murders even started. For instance, he had this strange fascination with electricity.
Electricity?
Yeah, he even worked at his family's candy factory for a while, and there are reports that he used the equipment there to torture small animals.
Oh, God. That's just Horrifying. It's
Weird
like a
idea.
twisted foreshadowing of what he would later do to his victims.
It's a classic example of those warning signs we often hear about in true crime, those early indicators of a troubled mind.
The signs that often go unnoticed or dismissed.
Exactly. And it's not just about Corll himself either. The sources also highlight the role of manipulation and control in his relationships with his teenage accomplices.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How did he manage to manipulate these teenagers into participating in such horrific acts?
Well, Corll was incredibly cunning. He specifically targeted boys who were often from disadvantaged backgrounds. Boys who maybe felt overlooked by society, who craved connection and acceptance.
So he preyed on their vulnerabilities.
Precisely. He would lure them in with promises of friendship, money, a sense of belonging. He gave them things they desperately wanted.
A twisted kind of hope.
Yeah, and once he had them in his grasp, he would slowly but surely erode their boundaries, distort their perceptions of what's right and wrong, and ultimately coerce them into taking part in his horrific acts.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to remember that each of those 28 boys had a name, a story, a family who loved them.
Absolutely. These weren't just statistics.
Yeah.
Each one was a son, a brother, a friend. Their lives were cut short, stolen by a predator who saw them as nothing more than objects.
Their absence left a gaping wound in the hearts of those who loved them, and that wound continues to ache even decades later.
It's a stark reminder that the impact of these crimes goes way beyond the immediate victims and their families. It ripples through the entire community, leaving behind this legacy of fear, distrust, and an overwhelming sense of loss.
And speaking of the community, we've talked about the shock and horror that gripped the Heights. But what about the aftermath? How did this case shape the neighborhood in the long run?
Well, the sources capture this really profound sense of betrayal and vulnerability that permeated the Heights after Corll's crimes were exposed. You have to imagine living in a place where you thought you knew everyone, where you felt safe letting your kids roam free, and then suddenly that sense of security is shattered.
It's like the very foundation of the community was broken.
Exactly. It makes you question everything and everyone. And for the families of the victims, the pain was even worse because they also had to deal with a sense of injustice.
You mean they felt like they weren't being heard?
Yeah. The sources reveal that many of the families felt ignored by law enforcement. They felt like their concerns were dismissed, like they were just overprotective parents, or that their sons were just being rebellious teenagers.
So on top of the unimaginable grief of losing a child, they had to deal with a system that seemed indifferent to their suffering.
It's a tragic reality we see play out too often in cases like this. The voices of marginalized victims are often silenced or dismissed.
And that just adds to the trauma and makes the healing process that much more difficult.
Absolutely. It's like a double injustice. First, they lose their loved ones in the most horrific way imaginable, and then they have to fight to be heard, to have their loss acknowledged and validated.
And sometimes that fight for justice can be a long and arduous one.
It can. The sources don't delve too deeply into the specifics of the legal proceedings, but we do know that both David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley were convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
So at least there was some measure of accountability, even though true justice in a case like this is an elusive concept.
How can you possibly put a price on the life of a child or erase the pain and suffering inflicted on their families?
It's impossible. And it reminds us that the impact of these crimes extends far beyond the courtroom. It reverberates through families, communities, and society as a whole, leaving scars that may never fully heal.
And that's precisely why it's so important to talk about these cases, to learn from them, and to work towards preventing similar tragedies from happening again.
You're right. As horrifying as this case is, we can't shy away from it. We need to confront the darkness, understand the complexities, and use this knowledge to create a safer world for our children.
It's about creating a culture where we're all actively engaged in creating safer communities, where we look out for each other, and where the well-being of children is paramount. As we've been unpacking this horrific case, it struck me how much this story is about more than just Dean Corll.
It is, isn't it? This goes way beyond the actions of one man, as monstrous as he was. It's a stark reminder of the vulnerability we all face, especially young people who are just trying to find their place in the world.
It really makes you think about how to protect the innocent when evil can wear such an ordinary mask. I mean, Corll was hiding in plain sight. He was someone people trusted, someone they felt comfortable around.
And that's what's so unsettling, right? It shatters the illusion that we can always spot danger. It forces us to acknowledge that even in seemingly safe spaces, we need to be vigilant. We need to be aware.
It all comes back to those early warning signs we talked about, Things like Corll's fascination with torturing small animals, Those are red flags that should never be ignored.
Absolutely. We can't just dismiss those signs as harmless quirks or boys being boys. We need to be more attuned to these subtle indicators,
Yeah.
both as individuals and as a society as a whole.
It's about developing a collective sense of responsibility, a shared commitment to looking out for each other, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
It's not just about being vigilant ourselves, though. It's also about empowering others, particularly young people, to recognize and resist potential danger.
Exactly. We need to have those open and honest conversations with them about abuse, about boundaries, and about the importance of seeking help if something feels wrong.
Giving them the tools they need to protect themselves and to understand that they have the right to say no. But these conversations can be so difficult to initiate, you know? Where do we even begin? How do we address such sensitive topics in a way that's both informative and empowering for young people?
I think it starts by creating an environment of trust and openness, a space where they feel comfortable sharing their fears and concerns without feeling judged. We need to listen to them, validate their feelings, and let them know they're not alone.
It's not just about talking either. It's about actually teaching them how to recognize dangerous situations and how to react when they find themselves in those situations.
It's about equipping them with practical skills and strategies, like setting boundaries, asserting themselves, and knowing how to seek help from trusted adults. You know, this case also brings to light the critical role that law enforcement plays in protecting our communities. We can't forget that the initial disappearances were dismissed as runaways, a failure that undoubtedly had devastating consequences.
It's a stark reminder that law enforcement needs to be more responsive, more attuned to the concerns of communities, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations.
It's about taking every report seriously, investigating thoroughly, and really looking for those connections even when they seem small or insignificant.
We need a system that prioritizes the safety and well-being of everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from.
It demands a commitment to ongoing training, sensitivity, and a willingness to question assumptions, even when they seem logical or convenient. Look, there are no easy answers here. There are no quick fixes that will prevent tragedies like this from happening again.
But what I've learned from this deep dive, more than anything, is the importance of vigilance, awareness, and a shared commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us.
We need to foster a culture of prevention, where we all play an active role in creating safer communities, where we look out for one another, and where the well-being of our children is always the top priority. The Lost Boys case is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. It's a story that chills us to the core, but it's also a call to action. It pushes us to confront the uncomfortable realities of the world we live in and to work together to prevent these kinds of horrors from happening again.
It's been a difficult journey, this deep dive. We've explored the depths of human depravity, the complexities of manipulation, and the profound impact of loss on individuals and communities. But we've also learned so much. We've highlighted the crucial lessons we can take away from this tragedy, the steps we can take to create a safer, more just world. And as a reminder, as horrifying as this case is, that we can't afford to be complacent. We have to stay vigilant. We have to speak up when something feels wrong. And we have to work together to build a society where every child feels safe, valued, and protected. If we can do that, then maybe, just maybe, we can find some meaning in the midst of this heartbreaking story.
I think you're right.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.